Hello, beautiful people of the internet. How are you doing today? My name is Jackie and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be talking about one of the earliest novels and, to some people, the worst book of all time, Pamela by Samuel Richardson. Man, let me tell you, if this was the first novel, I'm surprised that the novel as a genre continued. I recently read Pamela by Samuel Richardson for my class in college called The Rise of the Novel, which chronicles the rise of the novel in British culture throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. In fairness, Pamela did have some bright spots, but overall, this is a book that did not age well. That's for sure. Even at the time that it was published, the general reading public in Britain was in two groups. There were the Pamelites and the anti-Pamelites. Pamela always had its fans, and it also always had its detractors. So, you might be wondering, what is Pamela even about, and why has this book been so steeped in controversy from its very inception? Well, I'm glad you asked. Pamela, or as it's subtitled, Virtue Rewarded, follows Pamela Andrews, a 15-year-old servant, and yes, it's important to remember that she is 15, and Pamela is the paragon of virtue. Though she has very humble origins, she loves her parents, loves God, and it is very important to her that she save her virginity until she is married. Because, as her father tells her, if you lose your virginity before marriage, it's better that you're dead. Yeah, wish I was kidding. The novel Pamela is told in an epistolary format. It is told through a series of letters from Pamela to her parents, where she talks about her life and what is going on with her. After Pamela's kindly employer dies, her employer's son, Mr. B, is now her new master. And at first, Pamela thinks Mr. B seems like a nice enough guy. He seems to take a genuine interest in her and also gifts her some of his late mother's old things. Seems innocent enough, right? Wrong. Very wrong. You see, Mr. B is a total pervert who doesn't understand the meaning of the word no, and he desperately wants his underage employee to have sex with him. And when Pamela won't consent, he then turns from asking nicely to asking rudely, and then to outright coercion as he tries to get Pamela to have sex with him. Of course, Pamela, being the virtuous, good little Christian girl she is, will absolutely not have sex outside of marriage. Fellow employee Mrs. Jervis, who is a friend of Pamela, tries to help Pamela protect her virtue, but then she does a complete face turn and suddenly tells Pamela that it's her fault for making Mr. B act this way and completely victim blames her and aids in her attempted assault. Mr. B is ruthless in his pursuit of Pamela. He is desperate to have sex with her, and he tells Pamela, you know, Pamela, you should really be grateful because other bastards would just rape you. At least I'm asking. That's like the lowest of low bars. Much workplace sexual harassment ensues, including Mr. B trying to spy on Pamela while she's changing so he can see her naked. Nowadays, this kind of behavior would get you a lawsuit. When Pamela still stands firm and says that she will absolutely not be Mr. B's mistress, no matter how much money or nice clothes or favors he will give her, he decides that he's going to send her off to his other estate in the countryside so she can think about what she has done. Mr. B plans to force Pamela into a marriage with his parson, Mr. Williams, so therefore Mr. B will have all the access to Pamela he wants once she is married to Mr. Williams. However, it turns out Mr. Williams actually is not too bad a guy, though he was originally willing to go along with the marriage so that Mr. B would just bestow a living upon him. Once he sees the predicament that Pamela is in, he is sympathetic and feels obligated to help her. Meanwhile, Pamela is also continually harassed by Mrs. Jukes, the housekeeper at Mr. B's second estate, who has this really weird, kind of sexualized dynamic with Pamela, and Pamela says that you know Mrs. Jukes is a bad woman because she looks like a man. Yeah, we all know that masculine women can't be trusted. Pamela attempts to escape and return home to her parents, but then she sees a cow, which she mistakes for a bull, and she's so terrified of the bull that she goes back to Mr. B's house. Yeah, not the brightest one, that Pammy. And more bad news, Mr. Williams is thrown in jail after Mr. B finds out that he's been trying to aid in Pamela's escape. Mr. B then disguises himself as one of his servant girls so that he can sexually assault Pamela while she's getting ready for bed, and she falls into a dead faint. She doesn't know if Mr. B did anything to her while she was unconscious, and while he claims he didn't, I mean, is this guy really trustworthy? After Pamela almost dies, Mr. B shows her the tiniest sliver of human compassion that we didn't know he was capable of, and says that though he cannot marry her due to her inferior social standing, he will make her his mistress and give her lots of comfort and provide for any children they might have together. Still, Pamela is firm that she cannot marry him, and the reason she cites is because due to her inferior birth, she is not worthy of being a rich man like Mr. B's bride. She begs Mr. B to let her return home to her parents, and he eventually does so. On her way home, Pamela realizes that she's actually going to miss Mr. B, and therefore concludes that she must have been in love with him all along. Yeah, I wouldn't call that love. I would call it Stockholm Syndrome. After finding out that Mr. B is seriously ill, an illness which I think is supposed to make the reader feel bad for him, but didn't for me, Pamela decides that she is going to go back to him, convincing herself she is in love with him. Upon her return, Mr. B recovers, and after he and Pamela confess their mutual love, they are engaged to be married. Mr. B fell in love with Pamela after reading her letters about their relationship and seeing the way that she speaks about him. He has decided that her virtue should be rewarded by becoming his wife instead of just his mistress. So, Mr. B and Pamela get married, an event which is met by us 21st century readers with horror, but was actually received positively at the time. Pamela was an absolute sensation in England during this period, and it seems like a lot of readers were actually rooting for Mr. B to be redeemed and marry Pamela. In one English village, the local blacksmith would read aloud from Pamela every single night to the local villagers, and when they got to the portion of the novel where Mr. B and Pamela finally married, and I quote, "At length, when the happy turn of fortune arrived, which brings the hero and heroine together, and sets them living long and happily, the congregation were so delighted as to raise a great shout, and procuring the church keys, actually set the parish bells ringing." Yeah, not exactly my reaction to that part of the story. So, Mr. B and Pamela get married, poor Mr. Williams finally gets to leave jail, and the employees that Mr. B had previously fired for sticking up for Pamela got their jobs back. And you would think that's where the novel ends, but it somehow still manages to go on and on for like another 200 pages. Mr. B's snobby sister, Lady Davers, finds out that Mr. B supposedly married one of his servants, so she shows up to the house enraged and basically attacks Pamela. Mr. B tells his sister that he never wants to see her again for treating his wife that way, but Pamela begs Mr. B, saying that she doesn't want to be the cause of his estrangement from his most noble sister. Lady Davers, impressed by what a good girl Pamela is, decides that she is going to accept her as her sister-in-law after all. Turns out, Mr. B also has some past secrets which made Lady Davers doubtful of his intentions, because it turns out he had previously seduced another woman and fathered an illegitimate daughter by her. Finding out about this secret bastard child that her husband never told her about, Pamela is so enraged that she leaves him, never looking back. I'm just kidding. She says it's totally fine and that the girl can come live with them, and then they live happily ever after. The end. Nowadays, Pamela as a novel just does not hold up. This is the story of an underage girl being continually sexually harassed by her employer until eventually she gives in to his advances the moment he shows her the slightest bit of decency. In this time period, though, Mr. B's actions didn't generate the same kind of outrage that they would today. People were actively rooting for these two characters to get together. Overall, Pamela is sending the message that if you are a good, virtuous young woman who is chaste in everything that she does and always kind and generous, then you can change a bad man and make him faithful to you. But there are some things that are just unforgivable and impossible to look past. if marriage to a guy like Mr. B is how virtue is supposed to be rewarded, then I don't want to be virtuous. Like I said earlier, Pamela did have its detractors back when it was first published in 1740. However, the Pamela haters hated it for a very different reason. The general outcry was not that Pamela married her abuser, it was that a man of genteel status had married a girl who came from nothing. Later editions of the book actually changed Pamela's backstory, saying that her family had once been genteel and lost all of their money to quell the outrage. 'Cause, you know, people in 1740s England hated poor people. Author Henry Fielding, who you may know as the author of Tom Jones, hated Pamela so much that he wrote his own satire of it entitled Shamela. In this, Henry Fielding claims to know the real story of Pamela, and that the real Pamela was not nearly as good and virtuous as the story makes her out to be. He says that her real name is Shamela, and actually, she is a manipulative social climber who manipulates Mr. B in order to get him to marry her so she can have his money. She's also secretly sleeping with Mr. Williams, who is an alcoholic, and Mrs. Jervis is basically her pimp who aids in her deception. Henry Fielding also reveals Mr. B's full name as Mr. Booby, which is honestly kind of funny, and Booby is a name that a man like that deserves. On one hand, I can understand why readers would be frustrated with Pamela as a character. She is incredibly one-dimensional and doesn't seem to have much of a personality outside of her virtuosity. She also makes a lot of really bad decisions, so I can understand why that would have frustrated Henry Fielding and other readers. However, Shamela overall feels incredibly misogynistic. Fielding doesn't object to a man sexually harassing his employee. He just doesn't believe that any woman would actually be that chaste and good to resist a man's unwanted sexual advances. It doesn't present a favorable portrait of literally any woman in the novel. I know that so far in this video I have done nothing but tear Pamela to shreds, but honestly, I don't think this book is the worst book I ever read. It demonstrated a potential for a more sophisticated understanding. First of all, Samuel Richardson was one of the first writers to acknowledge that, what? Poor people are people too? My mind is blown. I didn't know poor people had feelings. There are some powerful moments in the text when Pamela asserts her own independence and her own intrinsic self-worth, which would have been a radical idea at the time. Just because she comes from a lower class background doesn't mean that she doesn't have the same right to bodily autonomy and the same self-worth. The character of Pamela also at times comments on how upper-class women are able to get away with certain behaviors that lower-class women cannot, such as when Mr. B's friends come over and ask her a bunch of intrusive questions, and she also acknowledges to herself that while wealthy men can engage in premarital sex, if a woman does that, her reputation is ruined, showing that Samuel Richardson did have some degree of understanding of classism and sexism in this period. Ultimately, Pamela is not the worst book I personally have ever read. I ended up giving it 2 stars, and I think had the story ended differently, I could have liked it a lot more. Had Pamela gone back home to her parents, or even married Mr. Williams instead, and Mr. B, I don't know, getting stomped on by bulls, dying of a venereal disease, or just never being able to have sex again, I think I really could have given this book a high rating. Regardless of Pamela's many, many, many faults, it was one of the earliest novels as we know them, and we have that to be thankful for, at least. So that is it for me today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments section what is the absolute worst book you have ever read. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. I post new videos every single Wednesday at 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. My social media links are down below if you want to follow me on Tumblr, Instagram, or be my friend on Goodreads. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fascinating rest of your day. Bye, and I'll see you in the next video.